we're going to pick 3 coaches each who will win their first national championship and make the case as to why. Then we will put the results up on my Twitter handle at Chris Vannini, some of them, and see who you guys think will be the next coach to win their first national championship. So, Ralph, you're first. You seem to think it's a pretty obvious number one. I'm not so sure, but we'll let you go first. Who is your first choice for the next coach to win their first national championship?
Well, before I give you the pick, let me explain what my thinking is here. And that is, I don't look at this quite so much as an evaluation of the coach solely. It's more of an evaluation of the programs and where you are still most capable of winning a national championship. So it's as much a state of the program, state of college football, which I think makes this conversation interesting too, having it now, because we are kind of wondering, are there more possibilities opened up to national champion? If we had this 4 or 5 years ago, it's a little bit of a struggle because it seems like the teams that can win a national championship are pretty small. So from my standpoint, when I pick I think the relatively obvious number one pick is Steve Sarkisian at Texas. It's as much about the station that Texas occupies right now in college football as it is about how good a coach Steve Sarkisian is, who has done a really great job over the last couple of years. Texas is back, right? Texas is no doubt
They
back.
are, folks.
Playoff team the last couple of years, right? And they look loaded. They look loaded to be the next team in the SEC that sort of pumps out national championship contending seasons every year for at least a few years. So I'm thinking it's Steve Sarkisian at Texas, and regardless of what you think about them for next year, and it certainly helps that next year they may go in as the preseason favorite.
Yes, that was going to be my pick too. Sark is a good pick. They were basically one play away from making the national championship game 2 years ago when they lost to Washington, nearly came back. They're 1 yard or so away from tying it up with Ohio State this year to potentially get into the national championship game. And they've got Arch Manning. Our friends at BetMGM, I think, have him as the number 2 favorite to win the championship next year. At least as of the title game, it was plus 550 behind Ohio State. So, yeah, I mean, Texas probably will be top 1, 2, or 3 next year. That's a good pick for number one in terms of coaches to win their first national championship. You know, it's not long ago that we had the 7-win Sark debate. Like, even 2 years ago, the question was, can Steve Sarkisian ever win big? Because he really hadn't done that anywhere. Washington, USC, or Texas starts off really poorly, but really built that team up to where they're probably the SEC favorite next year again, which is kind of wild.
Yeah, and that's why I think, again, this is as much about program as coach, right? If you ask me, is Steve Sarkisian the ex-best coach in college football? Let's just do this. If we said, if we just conceded that Kirby Smart was 1, Ryan Day's 2, Dabo Sweeney's 3, right? I mean, we can debate even that, but let's just say that because they all have national titles. And you said, okay, who's coming in at 4? Maybe Sark, maybe other, but that's not this conversation. This conversation is also built on, hey, what kind of program do you have built up right now and into the future? And where is college football in terms of what programs the national championship is available to?
Yes. So my first pick, the second overall pick, I am going to go with Dan Lanning in Oregon. They were the only undefeated team this year. They got a bye to the quarterfinals and got destroyed by Ohio State. But I did finish them with my preseason number 2, which upset a lot of Notre Dame fans, understandably. But
you were right, by the way. You were right.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're
right. Thank you. Look, they beat the only team they lost to. Right. And Notre Dame didn't. That's what it was. So
it was a sequencing. To vote for Notre Dame at number 2 was a nod towards sequencing, right? When they lost, as opposed to how they lost and what their record is. Anyway, not to run us into a ditch.
Yeah. So Dan Lanning has built Oregon up into kind of a juggernaut again. Dante Moore will take over at quarterback next year. They are going to continue to be loaded. They once again have cleaned up in the transfer portal. Dan Lanning knows how to accumulate talent as good as anybody in the country, right up there with Kirby Smart. I would say. And so you like the position Oregon is in. I think BetMGM has they're number 4 most likely to win the national championship next year. But I like what they've got. I think they'll learn from that Ohio State loss. Look, Ohio State turned out to kind of be a juggernaut, and that was just one of the most talented teams. They got a tough draw, Oregon did this year.
Yeah.
But top to bottom, elite team, elite talent coming back. There is the question, hey, can Dan Lanning win you the big game? He had all those narrow losses to Washington. You get blown out in the playoff by Ohio State. But I still think he's a really good coach. I think they'll get over the hump. They've got Will Stein, the offensive coordinator, back. Oregon, I like them for next year. Dan Lanning, my top pick. Would this have been your number 2?
Probably not. Probably not.
Okay.
Though
Then you got your first 2 picks here in your draft.
But without question, in competition, right? I certainly wasn't dismissing Lanning as this. Again, going back to where Oregon is, they seem to be building at a level where they will have talent equal to what we see at the programs that generally win national championships. But again, not necessarily an indictment of Lanning. Oregon has never won a national championship. So there is the question of, can they? Can being in Eugene, Oregon, the same questions that have hounded Oregon for years. Can you build a roster capable of winning a national championship when you are on the outskirts of the areas that you need to recruit in to build that type of roster? They certainly seem to be giving all the signs that they're able to overcome that in this new era. So I will not argue against Dan Lanning at number 2. He just would not have been my pick.
It really is the one thing missing from Oregon for them to be viewed as maybe not a blue blood, but as like a top level program. The fact that they haven't won a national championship. They've reached
the only
2
argument, and I almost
lost,
hate to bring it up because it tends to get thrown at them. Well, they've never won a championship. Well, you've never won it until you do. And then you do, and everything flips. I mean, it's the Ryan Day. You haven't won a big game until you win the big game, and then all of a sudden you won the big game, and we can't talk about that anymore.
I mean, look, they've played for 2 national championships more recently than Texas has in terms of the title game. So
absolutely. So again, good pick with Lanning. I don't think it would have been my pick, but he was definitely in consideration there. So yeah, I guess I got to go number 2 here.
Yes.
I will go with Brian Kelly.
Wow. Wow.
So again, Chris, this becomes a lot about where you're coaching and what the DNA of the program is, as much as who the coach is. Now, I am also a person who has very often defended Brian Kelly, who has an amazing record of success in college football at many different levels. I think nitpicking on Brian Kelly for the things he hasn't done is something, again, that we do because I think we look at college football, and I think a lot of us look at college football and we are too skewed on very small results, right? Very small sample sizes of results. I could easily throw Dan Lanning. Hey man, never even beat Washington. How good is that guy? Right. So
never beat Kalen DeBoer's Washington. Yes.
Kalen DeBoer's Washington. Right. Exactly. Because they did beat the pants off of them last year, but never beat Kalen DeBoer in those big games against Washington when titles and championships and playoffs were on the line. I just think Kelly's track record of success combined with LSU's track record of success. I wanted to do this right before we went on and I forgot, but I don't think the Joe Burrow team that won a national championship, I'm pretty sure that was not a top 4 or 5 team going into the season when it won it at LSU.
I'll look it up.
I am pretty sure that the Saban team that won the national championship way back in 2003, heading into the season, I don't believe that was like a top 5-ish preseason team. My point is, not only does LSU win with almost any coach that's there, it's won 3 national titles with 3 coaches. It's also a program that is inclined to being good enough to make big jumps, right?
Yeah.
To go
They win when you don't necessarily think they're going to win.
So I think there's probably already a little bit of buzz about LSU, had a good portal situation, had Nussmeier coming back. Maybe they're a top 10-ish team going into next season. Maybe they're 10 to 15. But in this new college football era where you don't necessarily have to be in the top 4 to just get in the playoff, I just think there's a lot of things that line up there for Kelly beyond just his own coaching acumen to say that, like, if you told me in the next, because I think we were almost thinking about too much of next year. If you just told me in the next 3 to 4 years, is Brian Kelly going to win a championship at LSU? I would think I would get pretty good odds at that. There's also probably pretty good odds that he gets fired.
Well, so that's the mat. So that's like the strategy in this draft here. So LSU is tied for 8th in BetMGM's national championship odds next year.
Right.
But we're drafting, but he's behind a bunch of coaches who have not won a national championship. So,
Sure.
But if you say, hey, I think Georgia and Ohio State are going to be the favorites to win the next couple of national titles, that kind of changes the math here. If you think, hey, I think Brian Kelly will win one in 3 years, but Ohio State and Georgia will win the next 2, then Brian Kelly makes sense as a pick there. So that's when you say it's not necessarily the pick for next year. But that's fascinating. I had Brian Kelly like pretty low on my list, and I didn't know if he was going to crack the top 6. But it is a fair point. I mean, LSU, they do sneak up on you when you least expected. That Joe Burrow team, preseason number 6 that year. Obviously, the year they won with Les Miles, they had 2 losses. They were the first 2-loss team to ever win a national title. So Garrett Nussmeier is coming back. You think he'll take a big jump again, could be the top quarterback next year. It's interesting. I definitely would not have taken Brian Kelly here. But
I would just put it to you this way.
I do see the upside.
Yeah, I would just put it to you this way, Chris. If I can just get Kirby to win one next year, considering like the arc of LSU, I have thought the arc of LSU is 2026. Like they sort of blew the first year of recruiting there and got themselves behind the 8 ball. I think that they are retrenching this year with the possibility of taking a big jump forward, but I'm still a little skeptical. But I could also see 2026 being a year where LSU is now, if they get the quarterback right for that year, like full bore, like ready to be fully operational, because they started slow under Kelly. So all I need is Kirby to do the deed next year, and that gets me to 2026. And now I think I'm in pretty good shape.
Kirby or Ryan Day. That's the weird thing about LSU.
Kirby is better situated for next year. I think the transition at Ohio State next year looks like it's going to be substantive enough that it reminds me of Georgia. Well, I was going to say recent Georgia, right? Where there's just so much turnover that maybe
I'd say Michigan this year. I think they'll win more than 8, but probably Michigan this past year is most likely. So, okay. Yeah. So you got Brian Kelly with your number 2 pick, the 3rd pick in the draft. That leaves me with a lot of options here. A lot of options. Some options I didn't.
You can do the like, man, like we have like they were like 5 on my board, right? Like that whole draft thing. We have like
they literally. I had Kelly. I want to say like 7th or 8th here. So this kind of leaves me in a tough spot because there's like 3 guys I could really. There's 3 guys I could really pick here.
Okay.
And I think I have to take this guy here with my number 2 pick, number 4 pick in the draft, Marcus Freeman, Notre Dame. He just went to the national championship. So he's got to be on here. And I think they turned the corner this year, post Northern Illinois. The run they went on in the playoff to beat Georgia the way they did, to come back and make it competitive with Ohio State, to come back against Penn State. That told me that there is very much a buy-in and a toughness there that we have not seen at Notre Dame in quite a while. And their offensive line, they're going to have the best offensive line in college football for like maybe the next 2 years. Like that's how loaded they are up front. They've lost a couple of guys from this year's line because there's no room left because they have that many good dudes up front. And if you've got a really good offensive line, I really like your team. We'll see what happens at quarterback. They like Carr. CJ Carr, we'll see if he's the guy. But I really feel like Notre Dame has found an identity now under Marcus Freeman The recruiting's gone pretty well. They're portaling pretty well. He almost just won it. So I'm going to go Marcus Freeman. What do you think? Would that have been your pick?
I don't know if it would. He also a potential. Like he was potentially there at number 2. He was a potential number 2 pick for me. If you, I don't know if you realize this, because we did some bold predictions for next year for the Athletic. All the Athletic national writers were asked to submit some bold predictions for next year, and because I love chaos and I just like juicy stories, my bold prediction for next year was Brian Kelly beats Notre Dame in the national championship. LSU and Brian Kelly beat Notre Dame in the national championship game, because it would just be so juicy for that national championship game to even occur. Understanding, again, bold prediction, right? I'm not necessarily saying that that's what's going to happen, but it would be file under bold prediction. Marcus Freeman would absolutely be on my list here. And again, it continue. I don't want to keep repeating myself. It keeps going back to that idea of, are we sure Notre Dame can win a national championship? Now, they are clearly closer than they have been. What they did to Ohio State and what they did throughout the playoff was very different from what we saw Kelly when they got into those big game playoff situations. And you could tell that team is not at the same level as the team that they were at, as those 2 or 3 teams that had separated themselves from the rest of the country. The super team era seems to be fading away. So now we don't have 2 or 3 teams that separate themselves from the rest of the country. Maybe that group expands out to about 6 or 7, 5 or 6 teams that we go in.
I thought 6
national
this year.
Championship. Yeah. So if that's where we're going to be now, it makes sense that Marcus Freeman is on, and Notre Dame is on that list and can be on that list.
Okay. Your last pick, you've got Steve Sarkisian, Brian Kelly. Who is your last pick here on who could win their first national championship?
So yeah, this one is vexing me just a little, because
we're in kind of like that pool after Sark and Dan Lanning. I think it was a pretty like big pool of guys who I think are all kind of in the same area.
Yeah. I'm going to lean into my fundamentals here, right? I've established the fundamentals of this draft for me are going to be not as much coach, but position. What places, what coaches in position at a program that wins national championships that I can feel, fairly comfortable with that coach. And trust me, James Franklin is here, and I've been much like with Brian Kelly, I have been a big defender of James Franklin and his resume, saying that we often don't give nearly enough credit to Franklin to what he has built at Penn State and focus too much on his shortcomings. That said, I will take Kalen DeBoer, because he is coaching at a place that wins national championships, and they just recruited number 1, number 2, number 3.
I think they were number 2, but they didn't fall off. They have not fallen off in the way people wondered that they would. Because I think Kalen DeBoer had like never signed a top 100 player before, and now he has done a lot. So his first class was well done.
And again, this would be understanding that I don't know if they can make that jump. There still seems to be a transition period going on here. And next year could be, especially with quarterback questions, that they're still getting it figured out exactly what Kalen DeBoer's Alabama program is going to look like and what the ceiling is on Kalen DeBoer's Alabama program. I think you could get as good odds that Kalen DeBoer doesn't make it to 2027 as you could Kalen DeBoer has a national championship by 2027.
Yeah.
I think, because one more iffy season and all of a sudden, who knows what happens at Alabama.
You cannot do what you did this year. Yeah.
I think he is a really good coach, and that is a program that wins national championships. So if you told me, can they win one within 3 years? Yes. So I'll take Kalen DeBoer. And boy, am I an
Again,
SEC homer, huh? Like I am.
you are an SEC homer.
Woof.
The SEC Network's Ralph
Yeah,
Russo.
it just
You,
means more, right? Woo,
you
boy.
very, like you said, you've clearly gone with programs that can win. Texas, LSU, Alabama.
Yeah.
The problem is, two of those, I really don't love them next year necessarily, especially Alabama in figuring out the quarterback situation. So it's, again, is it Ryan Day and Kirby Smart are going to win titles and then Alabama figures it out, or does somebody else get in here? So Alabama, Kalen Barr, Alabama's 7th in BetMGM's national title odds next year. They signed the number 3 composite recruiting class with 8 top 100 players. Ryan Grubb coming back. I do think that was a very big hire, a good get for them. And I'm guessing they'll have a quarterback who's kind of more situated with what they want to run on offense. All right, so my last pick here, I've got Dan Lanning and Marcus Freeman. And this is tough. I got a few people still on my list. I've got Lane Kiffin on my list. I've got Mario Cristobal on my list.
Yeah, Cristobal was on my list.
I've got Sharon Moore on my list in my pool here.
He was in my head.
Bryce.
Yes, I don't know if he was on my list, but he was in my head.
If Bryce Underwood is what we think he could be,
yeah,
and we know they have defensive talent, and if it was a turning the corner moment this last year, but kind of, I feel like I have to do it. I'm going with James Franklin, Penn State. They are my preseason number 1 team for next year. You're bringing back Drew Aller. You're bringing back Katron Allen. You're bringing back Nick Singleton. DDS. You just hired Jim Knowles. Pay him $3 million. Penn State is going all out for a national championship next year. They're doing the same thing that Michigan and Ohio State have done the last 2 years. And so it wouldn't have felt right to not pick them here, considering that situation. A team that I think maybe should be favored to win it all next year. To not have them picked in this draft, I don't think would be right. So I'm going to go with James Franklin, even though, yes, we know his numbers in the big games. Actually, Ralph, you're the James Franklin defender, as you just said. So you make the case. You make my case for James Franklin. Can you do that?
I can. Well, the problem is it's not as much making the case for James Franklin. Again, it's making the case for Penn State. For Penn State having the ability to put together a roster that has the level of talent that matches Ohio State and some of these big SEC contenders, right? These SEC perennial contenders. And even going into next year, you have them as your preseason number 1. They might end up being AP preseason number 1. Our pal Stu Mandel had them.
I talked Stu into it, by the way. Stu initially did not have them number 1, but when I asked him about it at the title game, I think it was the next day, or no, it was that day or something like that. And I was like, I really think I talked him into Penn State. No one had talked him into Penn State yet, and so that one's on me. They are 5th in BetMGM's national title odds, but man, 1-14 versus top 5 teams. 4-18 versus top 10 teams. That is the hurdle you have to get over. But I do think, as with Sark, as with Notre Dame, you keep pounding on that door. Eventually, it doesn't happen till it happens. And I do think it can happen, especially with the team they have coming back next year.
So that's always been my defense for Franklin, is that you don't move away from the coach who has you sort of on the precipice. If you're constantly in the discussion, constantly giving yourself a chance, at some point you break through, because there's no way you could guarantee, or even you're more likely by switching coaches to move back than to move forward, right? I always try to frame it that way. I still wonder, though, because this becomes a discussion about, can they win the national championship next year? And I still look at a team that goes, I don't know, like, can a team that is deficient at wide receiver win a national championship in today's college football? I don't know if they're going to make up the ground to do that. I have been a big Drew Aller supporter, right? I have been a guy who thought, like, man, I see a lot of good stuff there. But holy cow, like that was not great in all of the playoff. He had moments in the first two wins, but certainly in the definitive game, he wasn't very good. So can this team, it was easy for me to see the Michigan team as constructed taking the leap and taking the next step. It was really easy for me to see the Ohio State team as constructed taking the next step. I think myself, like a lot of people, picked the Ohio State team. I actually had some trepidation about Michigan. Again, for the old school reasons, like can Michigan get over the hump? Are they built in a way in this? Yeah,
and Georgia had won the last two national titles, so the competition was different too.
And there's a world in which there's a different playoff format. Georgia gets in 2023 and wins the national championship, right? There is
there's
a very good argument that Georgia was the second best team in college football the year Michigan won it, and I'm not slighting Michigan. That's it. That opens up.
You're just repeating the Greg Sankey talking points that he repeated that day on
exactly because I am an
college
SEC
game day.
Yeah, exactly. When I'm filling in for Feinbaum later this week, I'll be making sure to hit all these talking points. So again, my apprehension with Franklin is just an apprehension of can that team get over the hump? Is that team constructed in a way that it can get over the hump next year? And I still have some trepidations if you take the best defensive player in the country, maybe, or one of the two or three best defensive players in the country off that team, and you're still looking around to figure out who your great wide receiver is going to be to finally push Aller over the top. That's not necessarily an indictment of James Franklin. It's just,
Well, it is. The receiver situation is. It ultimately comes back to the head coach and your ability to accumulate talent. That is the job, and it's on them for not doing that. I do like the continuity of Andy Kolnicki coming back and continuing to build on what they did offensively. Drew Aller has to be better in the biggest games. And the word was after that Ohio State game was kind of when he had decided to come back because he wants to do that and get over the hump. And we had said it all year. No team is going to benefit from a 12-team playoff more than Penn State, who's constantly losing to Ohio State and just missing out. It happened, and they got to the semifinals, and they nearly made it to the national championship game. This is my Franklin pick is kind of a swing on next year because if it's not next year, then it's probably not going to happen, I would say. But that's where you kind of have to do the math here on most likely to is it win one period or win one before anybody else. And I think James Franklin makes sense in that context. So these are the teams. This is the order. Ralph drafted Steve Sarkisian, Brian Kelly, Kalen DeBoer. I drafted Dan Lanning, Marcus Freeman, James Franklin. We're going to put the results up on my Twitter handle at Chris Vannini, so you guys can vote among that group in some form and let us know who won. But also let us know what you think. Call or text the Until Saturday phone line at 316-462-9852. If there's somebody we didn't even talk about who you think should be on this list, let us know. If you want to yell at Ralph for picking Brian Kelly third in this draft, please feel free to do that. We'll make sure he hears